So what's up YouTube? In today's video, we're gonna go over the proper steps you should take when you're trying to solve data structures and algorithms. If you're new to the channel, my name's Kenny. I make content every Tuesday and Thursday. Make sure you subscribe below. Also hit the like button. It definitely helps out the channel. And without further ado, let's go ahead and get into the video. All right, so from here, we're gonna go over some of the steps that I normally would take when I'm going through the process of an interview and I'm working with the interviewer either online or in person. So first thing first, I normally always do is I read the question out loud if I'm, obviously doing this online, or if I'm in an interview and the question's on the board, I'll read the question, or unless the interviewer is reading the question to me, the best thing I would do is make sure I have clear understanding around the question. So with that being said, I'm gonna go ahead and briefly read over this question just so, we can follow through together. So given an integer array, nums, return true if any value appears at least twice in the array. Now, at least twice is a big thing that I want to pay attention to. 2 is in bold, so it tells me I really should watch out for that. And let's go ahead and continue reading. In the array, and return false if every element is distinct. Now, I'm reading this slow only because I'm trying to read for clarity, not trying to read for speed. So again, you want to make sure you truly understand the question, because any little small part that you miss in the question could totally have you derailed in the wrong direction when it comes down to solving the problem. And the last thing you want to do is solve the problem incorrectly only because you missed out on some edge cases or so forth. So read the question slow, make sure you understand it. I would say, honestly, if you're reading it online, read the question 2 or 3 times just to make sure you truly understand what the question is asking you. So the next step I'll take is to verify your constraints. So typically, if you're solving a leak code problem, you'll have some constraints down here at the bottom. If you don't have constraints at the bottom, the next best thing I can say you can do is just ask your interviewer, hey, what are my inputs? What does the output look like? What am I gonna be passing in? Am I gonna be working with just integers? Is there a case where I may be working with strings? So forth. Make sure you ask clarifying questions around what's the constraints, how large is the number going to be, how small, or so forth. Even for this problem right now, we're looking at an array. So you may ask a question around, how big is the array going to be? How many integers are we working with? Are we working with negative numbers? Are they all positive numbers? Questions like that brings much more clarity around the problem that you're trying to solve, and it helps you intuitively understand what are you truly working with. So the next step beyond that is you want to make sure you go through and you ask clarifying questions to your interviewer. So you've already asked a question around the constraints, you've read the problem. Now you want to ask clarifying questions to your interviewer if you have any, which you should have some, because you should have at least a question or two just to be sure, you both are on the same page. Regardless if that question is just talking about the examples you have here, and you just want to come up with like another 4th example similar to what we're looking at right now. We're looking at the 3rd one, but you may come up with a 4th example that you say like, hey, okay, if I pass in these integers, I should be getting this particular output. Or I'm passing in this array with integers, I should get this output. And the interviewer will be able to tell you yes, no, or whatever, and then you guys go ahead and move forward from there. Now that you've talked about your examples, your constraints, your input, now what you want to do is probably go over edge cases. So a big edge case with this problem here that we're currently looking at is the fact that it says if any value appears at least twice. So that's something you want to talk about with your interviewer, just to be like, okay, if we're looking at this problem here and we have an array of integers, we're looking for any value that appears twice, regardless if that's negative numbers, correct, or positive numbers. The interviewer will tell you yes, no, so forth, or from there. And then from there, you again just make sure you have the examples down packed, and then you guys go ahead and move forward with your next step. So the next step is you want to go ahead and write out some pseudocode. And writing out this pseudocode, make sure you talk to your interviewer about what you're thinking. I don't care how crazy it may sound, it's best to make sure you're talking to your interviewer, because you don't want to be thinking about solving the problem and you're not talking about the problem out loud. So your interviewer doesn't know, what you're thinking. They don't have a gauge if you understand even how to start the problem. They don't have an understanding around what time complexity you're thinking about, what direction you're going in to solve this problem. So it's good to just think out loud, no matter how crazy it sounds. And I know that's probably not the best thing to say, but no matter how crazy it sounds, just talk out loud around how you're going to solve this problem. So for me, if I was looking at this problem for the very first time, the first thing I may say is, okay, by me looking at this problem, I see that we say if any value appears at least twice. So that means, for example 1, I'm gonna be looking at, okay, I have an array of integers 1, 2, 3, 1. So I'll see the first number 1, and then when I see number 1 again, I return true, correct? Yes, that's correct. All right, perfect. So the next step I may talk about is, all right, if I was to solve this problem, at least from a brute force approach, my brute force approach may be to use a nested for loop. Now, granted, if I use this nested for loop, that's actually going to be a pretty slow time complexity. The time complexity for that would be n squared. Now, n squared probably isn't the best approach to go with to solve this problem. There's a much better approach I can go with. And I think the better approach would be for me to either use a set or a hash table. Now, if I use a set or a hash table, granted, my time complexity would be better because I only need one for loop. I don't need a nested for loop. So the trade-off is, if I go ahead and I use a set or a hash table, I have to give up space. So in giving up space, the time complexity the space complexity for space will be O of n. But I only use one for loop. So using that one for loop, now my time complexity is O of n, which is much, much better than n squared if I had a nested for loop. And by me talking about the problem and giving my thought process around it, I'll also, come down here, write out some pseudocode. I may just, document what I'm thinking to the interviewer, just saying like, hey, if I go ahead and solve this problem using a nested for loop, we're looking at n squared, which is very slow. I don't want to go with that route. But if I go ahead and I use a stack, not a stack, but if I go ahead and use a set or a hash table, well, if I use either of those two, actually, I'll have O of n because I only need to use one for loop. But the trade-off is I'm gonna be having one for loop and it'll be O of n as far as time complexity, but I have to give up space. So my space, I'll just write, will be also, my space will also be O of n. And I'll go over here and, just talk this through to my interviewer. And by me talking this through to my interviewer, my interviewer now can see like, okay, I have two solutions I could possibly go with. But I will tell them that, hey, I will think that going with either a set or a hash table would be the best approach. We can give up space, but the time complexity is the big factor here that we're looking for. And 9 times out of 10, the interviewer will say, okay, that sounds great. If you go with the set or hash table, what is your thought around how do we check things? So what I would just say is like, okay, well, with this set or hash table, I could easily just go ahead and add pretty much every integer into the set or hash table. And I can call .contains, because that's pretty much what we have in Swift. I can call .contains to see if the set, if the integer that we just added previously is inside the set. If it's inside the set, then we'll return true. If not, we'll just go ahead and add it to the set. And then at the end, if we haven't returned true in any case, we'll just go ahead and return false. And that'll be the end of solving the problem. And from there, the interviewer will say, okay, that sounds great. Go ahead and move forward and let's start writing some code. So from there, I'll go ahead and start writing out the code here, which I added already. I added a set. I have one for loop. I wrote the code for contains and added my integer inside of my set down here. But if we see that our set contains the number already, we'll just return true, exit out the program, or exit out the method rather. If not, and we're constantly just adding integers inside of our set, but we never return true here, then obviously we'll just go ahead and return false. Now, if you're very much so new to time complexity or how to solve some of these data structures and algorithms, I highly suggest you practice on LeetCode. Make sure you do some studying around what our time complexity is and different things like that, time as well as space. And go ahead and, make sure you take your time to learn all those things, because they're very important when it comes down to solving these problems. Now, in your very much so beginner stage, if you can just solve the problem, great. Just try to see if you can solve the problem. Then from there, look to see if there's a much more optimal solution when it comes down to solving some of these problems. Typically there are. So just look for that, and that'll kind of help you not only learn, but also help you when you get into an interview. You'll know that, okay, there's a better solution than the first solution I have, because I've practiced on so many problems and I've seen, how to solve one problem versus another. So, but yeah, outside of that, after you solve the problem, the next thing I would recommend you do is just go ahead and write out some test cases, just to be sure, the thought process you have matches what you actually wrote out. And after doing that, and you've practiced with, some test cases, the test cases look good. The very last step is, confirm everything with your interviewer on, the edge cases you've found, your thought process around how the problem works, your input and output of what you're expecting. And then lastly, let the interviewer take a look at it. Or if not, you'll just go ahead and run the code like we can do here. We'll just go ahead and run our code, which everything will pass. So we'll be happy to see that. And then we can go ahead and submit, which I've already submitted this already, because I broke this a long time ago. So I know this works. But yeah, outside of that, that's pretty much it. The biggest thing when it comes down to these interview problems or LeetCode problems in general is, number one, make sure you completely understand the problem. 2, watch your constraints. 3, look for any edge cases and talk to your interviewer, ask clarifying questions to ensure that you understand what your input and output is going to be. And then lastly, write out, well, not lastly, but the next step is write out some pseudo code, just so the interviewer has an understanding of what's your process and how you're thinking about solving this problem. Talk about time complexity of, the solution you have. And then from there, if you and your interviewer are both on the same page and they agree with, okay, time complexity you giving me and space complexity sounds good, so let's go ahead and start writing out the code for it. Last thing, just write out the code. And then from there, just go ahead and make sure you check your edge cases and just double check that, the input that you have, for example, will give you the same output as well. So if you passing in this input here, 1, 2, 3, 1, and then you see, the output is true, just make sure that, everything checks out. And then from there, just, verify with your interviewer and you should be good. So with that being said, I just want to thank you guys for watching the video, and I'll see you in the next one. See you.